Nora Prescott pushed open the door to room 4, sat down in the leather chair, and started talking. She said she was tired. She said the company she had built was collapsing from the inside. She was 2 sentences in when she noticed the hands across from her ruff, lined with sawdust, not a therapist's hands. Garrett Linden looked at her the way someone watches rain through a window. Dr. Helen Carr appeared in the doorway. Garrett spoke first. "She can stay. I was about to tell the truth anyway." Dr. Carr closed the door behind her. She did not sit down immediately. She stood between them, Garrett in the chair by the window, Nora frozen near the desk, and she made a clinical decision in under 3 seconds. "There's been a scheduling overlap," she said. "Nora, your session was moved to 4:30. Garrett started at 4. Nora's face shifted from confusion to embarrassment. She reached for her bag. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I'll wait outside." But Garrett shook his head. Not fast, not performative, just a single, steady motion. "You already sat down," he said, "and I've been circling this thing for 6 weeks. Maybe I need someone in the room who doesn't already know the story." Dr. Carr looked at him for a long moment. She had been treating Garrett Linden for 5 months. She knew where he was in his process, at the edge of the thing he could not say, the thing he drove 40 minutes to Ashland every Tuesday to sit across from and avoid. And she understood, in a way that training and instinct merged, that the presence of a stranger had shifted something. The room was no longer just a container. It had become a stage, and sometimes the stage was what people needed. "Garrett," she said carefully, "if you're sure." He was sure. He did not look at Nora when he began. He looked at the window, at the line of oaks outside, and he started talking about his wife, not about how she died, about how he failed her while she was dying. He talked about the hospital nights, the ones where he sat in the chair beside her bed with his laptop open, answering emails from New York while she slept under morphine. He talked about the fluorescent light above the bed and how it buzzed at a frequency he could still hear 3 years later in any quiet room. He talked about the last time she woke up and looked at him and asked simply, "Are you here?" And he had said yes, but his eyes were on the screen. He said that word yes, and she had closed her eyes again, and he did not know whether she believed him. He still did not know. Nora did not move. She did not shift in the chair or reach for her bag or look away. She did not know this man, not his name, not his age, not his reason for being in this room, but something about the way he spoke, raw, undefended, without the scaffolding of justification or the polish of rehearsal, held her in place. He was not asking to be forgiven. He was not asking to be understood. He was simply saying what happened, and the honesty of it was so unadorned that leaving felt like it would break something that had just begun to form. When he finished, the room held still. Dr. Carr let the silence do its work. Then she turned to Nora, who was staring at her own hands in her lap, and asked gently, "Nora, would you like to come back Thursday?" Nora picked up her bag. She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the knob. She did not say yes, but she did not say no. Thursday came, and Nora was there at 4, not 4:30. 4. She told herself it was because the earlier slot had opened up and her assistant had rescheduled without asking. She told herself it had nothing to do with the man in the chair by the window. But when she walked into room 4 and saw Garrett already seated, same chair, same sawdust on his cuffs, same stillness, she did not turn around. Dr. Carr studied both of them. "This is unusual," she said. "I want to be transparent. If we proceed as a joint session, both of you need to explicitly consent. This isn't couples therapy. This is 2 individuals choosing to be present during each other's process." "Garrett?" He nodded. "Nora?" She hesitated. Then she sat down. Garrett picked up where he had left off, but the story had moved. He was no longer in the hospital. He was in the aftermath, the months after his wife's death, when the world expected him to grieve on schedule and return to function. He talked about selling everything. The apartment in Manhattan, the shares in a company he had helped build. He talked about leaving a position he had held for 11 years, and Dr. Carr, glancing at her notes, said it without thinking. "After your years in corporate finance, the transition must have." She stopped, but the words were already in the room. Nora caught them. She did not react visibly, but something behind her eyes recalibrated. A carpenter with years in corporate finance. A man with sawdust-stained hands whose therapist referenced a career that did not match the calluses. She filed it away. She did not ask. Garrett noticed the slip. He could have corrected course, could have clarified, could have built a wall around the detail and moved on. He did not. He kept talking about his son, Emmett, who was 8 years old and had stopped speaking to strangers after his mother died. Not selectively mute in the clinical sense, but quiet in a way that had edges, about learning to be a full-time father through trial and failure, burned dinners, missed school pickups, bedtime routines that took 3 hours because he could not remember the right order of things his wife had known by instinct. Nora listened to all of it, and then, for the first time since she had walked into this room by accident on Tuesday, she spoke. Not to Dr. Carr, not in response to a prompt. She spoke into the open space between Garrett's words, and what she said landed like a stone dropped into still water. I built a company that teaches people how to heal, and I can't sleep through the night. No one responded immediately. Dr. Carr let the weight of it settle into the room, then she leaned forward. I'd like to propose something. If both of you are willing, we continue these sessions together. Not as therapy for a relationship, there is no relationship here, but as a shared space where two people working through difficult truths can witness each other's process. She paused. Garrett? He nodded, slower this time, as if he understood that what he was agreeing to now was different from what had begun 2 days ago. Nora? Nora looked at the window. She looked at the line of oaks outside. She nodded. Later than him. Slower. But she nodded. The boardroom at Prescott Wellness Group sat on the 7th floor of a glass building on Siskiyou Boulevard. Nora took her seat at the head of the table. Victor Staines took his at the opposite end, and the distance between them was measured in more than square footage. Victor had called an emergency session. He did not use that word, he called it a strategic alignment review, but everyone at the table understood the subtext. He opened with data. Quarterly revenue was down 9% across all clinics. 2 regional directors had resigned in the same week, one citing philosophical differences, the other citing nothing at all, which was worse. And a journalist from the Oregonian had contacted the communications team asking about what she called internal burnout culture at a company that marketed wellness as a product. Victor let the numbers sit on the table like evidence at trial. Then he folded his hands and said, with the rehearsed precision of a man who had practiced the line in front of a mirror, I want to be clear, I am not questioning Nora's dedication. I am questioning whether the current pace is sustainable for any leader, including her. He paused. Perhaps what's needed is a temporary step back. For personal health. The irony cut cleanly. The CEO of a mental health empire advised that she might not be mentally healthy enough to lead. Nora felt it land, and she saw the faces around the table register it, and she said nothing. She could not say what she wanted to say, that Victor had been laying groundwork for months, that his concern was a blade shaped like compassion, because the room would only hear defensiveness. So she thanked the board for their vigilance and moved to adjourn. That same afternoon, Garrett was in his workshop on the eastern edge of Ashland when his phone rang, a New York area code he had not seen in 3 years. Martin Hess, the attorney who managed his late wife's trust for Emmett. Routine paperwork, Hess said, except for the part that was not routine. You still hold voting shares in Linden Capital, Garrett. 12% of the restructured fund. The board has been asking about your intentions. They want a signal hold, divest, or exercise. Garrett ended the call without answering. He set the phone face down on the workbench and picked up the hand plane and ran it along a length of white oak until the sawdust curled away in thin ribbons. 3 hours later, after the workshop had gone dark and he had driven into town for milk and bread, Garrett saw Nora. She was sitting alone at a corner table in a coffee shop on East Main Street, laptop open, coffee going cold. She noticed him at the same moment he noticed her. The awkwardness was instant and precise. In the therapy room, they knew each other's wounds. Outside of it, they were strangers who happened to share an intimacy they had not earned through the usual channels. He stopped at her table. Neither of them knew the protocol for this. Nora spoke first. Do you always drink black coffee? Garrett looked at the mug in his hand. Only when I'm avoiding something sweet. Neither of them laughed, but the air between them shifted lighter by a fraction, warmer by a degree. Victor Staines did not operate on instinct. He operated on information, and information was a resource he knew how to acquire. Within 48 hours of the board meeting, He had retained a private investigator not to surveil Nora directly, but to assemble what he described as a behavioral profile. The report came back thin but pointed. Nora Prescott was attending therapy at a clinic on Oak Street in Ashland. Nothing remarkable for a CEO under sustained pressure, but she was not attending individual sessions. She was participating in a joint therapy format with an unidentified male, tall, early 40s, work clothes, no suit. The investigator had no name. Victor did not need a name. He needed a narrative, and the narrative wrote itself. A CEO in a personal entanglement that was clouding her professional judgment. He began placing the idea quietly in phone calls to board members that lasted exactly 8 minutes each, long enough to seed doubt, short enough to avoid the appearance of lobbying. In room 4, the third session had shifted in texture. Garrett was deeper now, moving toward the center of what Dr. Carr had been guiding him toward for 5 months. "I wasn't a bad husband," he said. He was looking at the floor. "I was an absent one. I answered every email. I made every board call. I flew back and forth between New York and the hospital in Portland 17 times in 4 months, and every time I walked into her room, I carried the office with me. She could feel it. She never once said, 'Put the phone down.' She never once said, 'Be here with me.' And that made it worse, because if she had fought me, I could have changed, but she just let me be absent. And I let her let me." Nora was crying. Not loudly, she was not a person who cried with sound. The tears moved down her face in silence, and she did not wipe them away. She was not crying for Garrett. She was crying because she recognized the architecture of his failure. It was identical to hers. She had built a life designed around being present for everyone except herself. She was absent from her own existence, and no one had called her on it either. Dr. Carr watched the shift with clinical precision. Garrett, for the first time, turned to Nora, not as a fellow patient addressing a witness, as one person asking another person a real question. "What did you want to be before all this?" Nora was quiet for a long time, long enough that Dr. Carr nearly intervened. Then she said, "A park ranger. I wanted to live in the trees." Garrett did not comment. He did not smile, but the way he looked at her changed, not romantically, not yet, but in the way a person looks at someone they are beginning to see rather than merely observe. 2 days later, Victor called Nora directly. His voice was warm in a way that contained no warmth. "I've been thinking about what happened at the board meeting, Nora. I want you to know this comes from a place of genuine concern. Maybe it's time to consider a leave of absence. Recharge. Come back when you're ready." Nora gripped the phone. She knew exactly what this was. She had built a career reading people, and Victor Staines was not difficult to read. But knowing the play and having the energy to counter it were two different things. She said she would consider it and hung up, and she sat in her office until the light through the windows turned from gold to gray. Garrett picked up Emmett from school at 3:15. The boy climbed into the passenger seat of the truck, buckled his seatbelt, and stared out the window as they drove past the pear orchards on the edge of town. Garrett did not push. He had learned, across 3 years of parenting alone, that Emmett's silence was not emptiness, it was processing. 5 minutes from home, Emmett spoke. "Dad, do you talk to anyone? Like, really talk?" Garrett slowed the truck. He glanced at the rearview mirror, though no one was behind them. "Yeah, buddy, I started talking to someone." Emmett considered this with the seriousness of a much older person. Then he said, without looking away from the window, "Good. Mom would have wanted that." Garrett pulled into the driveway and sat with both hands on the wheel after Emmett had gone inside. The boy was 8 years old. He should not have carried that kind of awareness, but he did, and it was precise, and Garrett felt the truth of it settle in his chest like a stone finding the bottom of a river. Across town, Nora stared at her laptop screen. An email had arrived from the editorial board of the Ashland Daily Tidings, a request for an interview about leadership challenges at Prescott Wellness Group. The phrasing was neutral. The timing was surgical. She called her personal attorney, a woman in Portland named Sandra Keel, who listened without interrupting, and then said, with the practiced calm of someone delivering difficult news, "If Victor secures enough proxy votes at the next board meeting, you could be removed within 30 days. You need to decide fight or negotiate an exit." "There isn't a middle option." Nora thanked her. She hung up. She did not call anyone else. Thursday, the fourth session. The atmosphere in room 4 was different from the moment Nora walked in. She sat rigidly, hands clasped tight in her lap, jaw set. She did not speak first. She did not speak second. Garrett watched her for a moment, then looked at Dr. Carr, who gave a small nod that said, "Proceed." So Garrett did what he had learned to do in this room. He did not offer advice. He did not offer comfort. He offered a story. "The first bookshelf I ever built for Emmett," he said. "I measured every board twice, cut every joint to the 1/4 inch, sanded it until my hands were raw, and when I put the whole thing together, it leaned, not dramatically, maybe 2 degrees off plumb, but enough to see. I was ready to tear the whole thing apart, but Emmett came in and looked at it and said, 'It's perfect, Dad. Books don't need to be straight.'" Nora's face did something, not a smile, not quite, but a softening. The corners of her mouth pulled down first as if resisting, and then they lifted. It was the first time she had come close to laughter in that room, and the sound she made was so quiet that only Garrett heard it. He did not look at her when she made it. He looked at his hands. After the session, Nora walked into the hallway and stopped. She turned and looked back at the closed door of room 4. She did not know what she was doing here anymore. She did not know whether this was healing or dependency, whether she was getting better or getting attached to the process of watching someone else get better. She was still standing in the hallway when the elevator doors opened. Victor Staines stepped out. He was wearing a dark coat, as if he had come from outside. His eyes found Nora. Then they moved to the door behind her, to the nameplate that read Dr. Helen Carr, licensed clinical psychologist, and then back to her face. He did not speak. He did not need to. His expression said one thing: noted. Nora did not move. The hallway held its breath. Victor Staines returned to his office that evening and typed a name into a search engine: Garrett Linden. The results loaded quickly, and they carried weight. Garrett Linden, co-founder and former chief financial officer of Linden Capital, a mid-tier investment firm headquartered in Lower Manhattan, resigned 4 years ago in what the financial press described as an internal governance dispute. The articles were carefully worded phrases like irregularities in reporting practices and disagreements with senior leadership. But not one of them stated the central fact clearly. Garrett had been the person who reported the irregularities. He had filed a whistleblower complaint with the SEC, provided documentation of 18 months of systematic overvaluation of client assets, and then watched as the firm's legal team redirected the narrative until his departure looked indistinguishable from disgrace. He had not fought the coverage. His wife was dying. He chose to be in Portland, at her bedside, instead of in a courtroom defending his name. The shares, however, had remained. Garrett still held a controlling stake in the restructured fund, voting shares worth, by conservative valuation, north of $200 million. Victor read every article twice. Then he picked up the phone. The emergency board meeting convened within 72 hours. Victor presented his findings with the calm of a man reading a weather forecast. "Our CEO," he said, "is spending her therapy hours in joint sessions with a former financier who departed his own firm under a cloud of scandal. I am not making accusations about the nature of their relationship. I am raising a question about judgment." He let the word hang in the room. Judgment. Then he continued, "This is the person leading a wellness brand built on trust, transparency, and emotional integrity. And she is privately meeting with a man whose public record includes SEC investigations and allegations of financial misconduct." He did not mention that Garrett was the whistleblower. He did not mention that the misconduct had been committed by others. He mentioned only the cloud, and the cloud was enough. The board shifted. 2 members who had been neutral, Karen Lowe and David Pressman, asked pointed questions about reputational risk. Nora's budget signing authority was suspended effective immediately, pending review. That evening, Nora found Garrett outside the coffee shop on East Main. She did not sit down. She stood in front of him, and her voice was controlled in the way that requires visible effort. "You sat in that room, and let me believe you were just a carpenter. You let me say things I haven't said to anyone. And this entire time, you were what? A finance executive? An investor? Someone with an SEC file?" Garrett met her eyes. "I am a carpenter," he said. "Everything else is what I used to be." "That's not enough, Garrett. I know." She turned and walked away. He watched her go. He did not follow. That night, Dr. Carr called him at home. Her voice was professional, but strained in a way he had not heard before. "She deserved to know, Garrett. Not from me, that's not my place. From you." Garrett sat in the dark of his workshop and listened. He knew she was right. He also knew something that could not be seen from the therapist's chair, that if he had told Nora the truth in the first session, or the second, or the third, she would have stood up and walked out. She would have seen another powerful man with an agenda, and both of them would have lost the only space where either of them had started to breathe. Garrett sat in his workshop alone. The half-finished oak table for a restaurant in Medford rested on the bench, untouched for 2 days. He opened his laptop for the first time in 3 years. The password still worked. His access to the Linden Capital Management portal still worked. His voting shares 12% of the restructured fund, flagged as holder. Garrett J. Linden, status, unexercised, were still active. He scrolled through the fund's current portfolio allocations. He read the most recent quarterly filings. He was not looking for a way back into finance. He was looking for what his shares could still reach, and who they could still protect. Thursday came. Nora did not appear at room 4. Dr. Carr sat with Garrett in the quiet room, and the empty chair where Nora usually sat held its own kind of presence. Garrett stared at the window for several minutes before he spoke. "I told the truth about everything except who I was," he said. "Does that count?" Dr. Carr did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice carried the weight of a woman who had spent 30 years listening to people negotiate with their own honesty. "Truth isn't a menu, Garrett. You don't get to pick which parts you serve." He absorbed this. He did not argue. He sat with the words the way he sat with wood, turning them over, feeling the grain, understanding that the shape they wanted to take was not the shape he had planned. Victor, meanwhile, was accelerating. He had arranged an interview with a business journalist in Portland, framed as a soft profile of Prescott Wellness's next chapter. The questions were preceded. What does modern leadership in the wellness space look like? Is founder-led growth sustainable at scale? Victor's son-in-law, a 32-year-old management consultant named Bradley Tate, who had never spent a single day working in mental health, had begun attending board meetings as an observer. He wore expensive suits and smiled at everyone, and contributed nothing to the conversation, which was precisely the point. He was not there to speak. He was there to be visible, to be next. Nora was at home. It was past midnight, and she was sitting on her kitchen floor with her phone, reading. She had typed Garrett Linden into a search engine an hour ago, and she had not stopped since. She had read every article, every press summary, every SEC filing in the public record, and buried beneath the deliberately ambiguous language of financial journalism, she found the original whistleblower complaint. Garrett had not caused the scandal at Linden Capital. He had uncovered it. He had documented 18 months of systematic fraud, client assets overvalued by nearly 40%, and reported it first internally, then to federal regulators when the internal response was silence. The firm's legal team had responded by framing his resignation as mutual, by allowing the press to blur the line between whistleblower and wrongdoer, and by letting the narrative decay until no one could distinguish between the man who sounded the alarm and the man who started the fire. Nora set her phone on the kitchen tile. She understood now. She understood why he had left New York, why he had sold everything, why he had moved to a small town in southern Oregon and started building furniture with his hands. She understood why he sat in a therapy room and told the truth to a stranger, because the last time he told the truth to the world punished him for it. And she understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that she had a choice. She could believe the version of Garrett Linden that Victor Staines had presented to the board, the disgraced financier, the man with a cloud over his name. Or she could believe the man who had cried in front of her about his wife and never once asked to be forgiven. Nora walked into room 4 without an appointment. It was Thursday, 4 o'clock, and Garrett was already seated in the chair by the window. He looked at her when she entered, and she could see that he had not expected her to come. She sat down without speaking. Dr. Carr entered a moment later, paused in the same doorway where all of this had started, and closed the door behind her. She did not ask questions. She took her chair and waited. The silence lasted nearly 2 full minutes. Nora broke it. "I read everything," she said. Her voice was level, controlled, stripped clean of the anger from their last conversation. "I know what you did. The real version, not Victor's version." Garrett's face did not change. He did not look relieved. He did not look vindicated. He looked like a man who had been waiting 4 years for someone to say that sentence without knowing who would say it. Nora leaned forward slightly. Why didn't you fight back? You had evidence. You had legal standing. You could have cleared your name. Garrett was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was even but unsteady at the edges. Because my wife was dying, and I had to choose between being right and being there. I chose being there. The room absorbed the words the way dry ground absorbs rain slowly, completely. Nora pressed her palms flat against her knees and took a breath. Then she did something she had not done across 5 sessions. She talked about her own war. She told them about Victor, the board pressure, the manufactured narrative, the slow dismantling of her authority inside the company she had built from a single room. She said it without self-pity, without performance. I founded Prescott Wellness from one clinic, one rented office, one therapist on contract, and now a man who has never helped a single person heal is taking it away from me. Not because I failed, because I built it alone, and now there's no one standing beside me. Garrett listened without interrupting. He did not offer solutions. He did not strategize. He said, quietly, "You don't have to win alone." Dr. Carr spoke then, and her voice carried the precise gentleness she reserved for moments that would reshape a room. "I need to tell you both something," she said. "This will be the last joint session I can facilitate. Professionally and ethically, the dynamic between you has moved beyond a therapeutic framework. Whatever is developing here, it can no longer happen in this space." She looked at each of them in turn. Whatever comes next, it has to happen outside this room. They understood. The therapy room had been a container bounded, safe, mediated by professional distance. Outside of it, there was no Dr. Carr to hold the space, no 50-minute limit, no ethical guardrails to keep the thing between them defined. Garrett stood first. He walked out to the parking lot and leaned against the side of his truck and waited without knowing what he was waiting for. Nora came through the door 3 minutes later. She stopped about 6 feet from him. Neither of them spoke. Garrett reached into his jacket pocket and took out a folded piece of paper, a phone number, written by hand on a scrap of notebook paper. He held it out. Nora took it. Their fingers did not touch. She put the paper in her coat pocket, walked to her car, and did not look back. The board vote was called for 10 in the morning. Victor Staines arrived at 9:15. Reviewed his proxy count one final time, and allowed himself a small, private satisfaction. He had the vote 7 confirmed, enough for a supermajority. His son-in-law, Bradley Tate, waited in the lobby outside the boardroom in a new charcoal suit, scrolling through his phone with the comfortable posture of a man whose future had already been arranged. Nora arrived at 9:50. She walked through the glass entrance of the Prescott Wellness headquarters, and the people she passed could see that something in her had shifted. She was not armored. She was not performing composure. She was calm in a way that came from somewhere beneath strategy, the calm of a woman who had already accepted every possible outcome and found that the worst one was survivable. She took her seat. Victor smiled at her from the far end of the table. She did not return it. Victor opened with his motion. Nora listened. When her turn came, she did not present a counter-argument or show slides or, quote, market data. She stood and said this: "I started Prescott Wellness in a rented office on Oak Street in Ashland. 1 room, 1 therapist on contract, a waiting list written on an index card. I built it on a belief that mental health is not a product, it is a practice. If this board wants to turn it into a brand strategy managed by someone who has never sat across from a person in pain, I won't stop you. But I will take my name with me when I leave." The room went still. Then the boardroom door opened. A courier entered carrying an envelope addressed to the board of directors. Inside was a single letter, printed on the letterhead of Marsh, Hess, and Callaway, attorneys at law. The letter identified Garrett J. Linden as the controlling shareholder of Ridgeline Ventures, the investment fund that had provided Prescott Wellness Group Series B financing. No one at the table had known this, including Nora. The letter stated that Mr. Linden intended to exercise his voting shares in support of the current founder and CEO. The reason was a single sentence: founder alignment is the only metric that matters in a mission-driven company. Victor's face lost its color by degrees, the confidence first, then the composure. then the careful performance of calm. The vote was called. 7-4 in favor of Nora. She retained her position. Victor pushed back from the table and walked out of the room without looking at anyone. After the room emptied, Nora sat alone and read the letter a second time. There was no mention of a therapy room, no mention of her by name, no personal sentiment of any kind. It was professional, precise, and deliberately distant, but she knew what it meant. He had reached back into the world he had abandoned 3 years ago, the world that had punished him for telling the truth, and he had used the one thing he still held. For her, 2 weeks later, the oak table was finished. Garrett had sanded it that morning until the grain caught the light, and it sat now in the center of his workshop, waiting for delivery to a new coffee shop on the corner of Pioneer and 3rd Street in downtown Ashland. Emmett was in the corner of the workshop, perched on an overturned apple crate, drawing in his sketchbook with colored pencils. He had been quiet all afternoon, which was his way of being content. He looked up from his drawing and said, without any particular weight, "Dad, is that lady coming back, the one from the coffee shop?" Garrett set down the hand plane. "I don't know, buddy." Emmett returned to his drawing. Then, as if adding a footnote to a thought he had already finished, he said, "I hope so. She looked like she needed a friend." Garrett watched his son, the bent head, the careful strokes of pencil, the quiet certainty of a child who saw things clearly because he had not yet learned the adult habit of looking away. And he thought that an 8-year-old sometimes understood the world more precisely than anyone in it. The workshop door was open to the afternoon. Light came through it in a wide, warm rectangle, and the sawdust drifted in the beam like something living. Nora appeared in the doorway. She had not called. She stood at the threshold with her hands in the pockets of her coat, watching Garrett work for a moment before he looked up. When he saw her, she did not step back. "I didn't come to say thank you," she said. Garrett set down the polishing cloth. "Good," he said. "I didn't do it so you would." She stepped inside. It was the first time she had entered his space, not the therapy room, not the coffee shop, not the boardroom by way of a letter. His space. The workshop smelled like white oak and linseed oil, and the warmth that wood holds after it has been shaped by hand. They talked about the restaurant that had ordered the table, about how autumn in southern Oregon slowed everything down, the light, the pace, the way people moved through the streets of downtown Ashland, about the difference between red oak and white oak, and why white oak held up better in rain. Neither of them mentioned the board vote. Neither of them mentioned Victor Staines. Neither of them mentioned Room 4, or Dr. Carr, or the 6 Thursday afternoons that had started with a wrong door and ended with a right one. But everything they said rested on what had happened in that room, every sentence built on a foundation of silence and honesty that they had constructed together, one session at a time. Nora walked to the finished table. She ran her hand along the surface, slow, feeling the grain move beneath her palm. "It's warm," she said. Garrett leaned against the workbench behind him. "Oak holds heat." He reached for the pot on the shelf and poured a cup of coffee black, no sugar, and set it on the edge of the table in front of her. She looked at him. He did not look back, but he did not walk away. In the corner, Emmett kept drawing. The pencil moved in small, careful circles, filling in the leaves of a tree that leaned slightly to the left. Outside, the October light turned the sawdust gold, and the workshop held its warmth the way oak holds warmth, slowly, deeply, without letting go. Neither of them had been looking, but sitting in that workshop, with sawdust in the light and a child drawing quietly in the corner, both of them understood the door she walked through by mistake was the only one that was ever meant to open. If this story hit you somewhere real, here are 2 questions to sit with. Have you ever told the truth to a stranger and felt more seen than you ever did with someone who knew you? And have you ever walked through the wrong door, only to realize it was the only one you were supposed to open? Drop your answers in the comments, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time, because stories like this don't come from algorithms. They come from listening. Hit subscribe, and we'll keep listening together.